We're now coming to the end of John's Gospel, chapter 6. And Jesus has been talking about himself as the bread of life. And he's put this in a very strongly worded teaching. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. And he went on to say, furthermore, that if you don't, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. And that's something which was considered in the temple here, not in the synagogue, a very difficult thing to accept, a very difficult thing to understand. And we've come to the passage here where many of Jesus' disciples leave him because of the nature of that particular saying. We pick it up at John 6, verse 60. On hearing this, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who could accept it?" Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing, and the words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe, and who would betray him. He went on to say, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him." And from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. "And you do not want to leave too, do you?" Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe, and we know that you are the Holy One of God." Then Jesus replied, "Have I not chosen you, the 12? And yet one of you is a devil." He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. Hard sayings which are difficult to accept, hard teachings. I think if we understand Jesus' teachings aright, we would find many of them very hard teachings, hard to accept, hard to take on board, and hard to live by. In fact, that's the very nature of Jesus' teaching. It's a hard teaching because it's different from everyone else's teaching, and it therefore says things which are considered to be out of the ordinary, extraordinary, beyond the ordinary. Something which you would expect, of course, if you're listening to the words of God. So, on hearing it, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching, who can accept it?" Of course, they're referring to this passage here that I am the bread of life that has come down from heaven, and whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. Now, we've spoken numerous occasions, we've seen examples where Jesus is speaking on a spiritual level and they're thinking on a physical level. We think of rebirth, where they thought of that entering into the mother's womb a second time. We spoke of living water and give me this water to drink so I don't have to come back to the well. The bread of life, give us this bread so we don't go hungry. The idea of Jesus speaking in spiritual words but addressing people who could only understand on physical terms. And that's where this huge gulf lies between those who are spiritually minded and those who are earthly minded. Most people did not see beyond the mere physical words. And even by now you might have expected Jesus to have been understood as someone who spoke words in a spiritual way and not in a merely physical and crass and base way. That's because he saw connections which we never properly saw. Connections with bread and life and spiritual life and water and thirst and hungering and rebirth and birth itself. All of which has become common to us now in the way in which we think, because these ideas have saturated our understanding. But in those days, they were huge, dramatic gulfs of which we had to cross in order to understand what Jesus was saying. A huge leap of spiritual understanding. And many people couldn't make that leap because, well, as Jesus said, they didn't have ears to hear. They didn't have, they weren't drawn by God to understand. Jesus never watered down his teaching, you notice. He made it quite clear that if people were repelled by what he said, that was because God did not draw them to him. He didn't change his message to make it simpler or easier, but rather he required everyone to come up to the level of his understanding. In a way, it's a filtering process. It filters out the crass, the base, the lower understanding from those who have a real spiritual insight into what is being said here. Those who understood him to mean he literally meant eat my flesh and drink my blood, they were repelled by the teaching. They couldn't go along with it. Those who had a spiritual understanding of that, those who could get beyond the mere physical, could leave all of that to one side and understand that within his teaching, within his metaphors, within his ideas, there is a spiritual truth to be grasped if only we can get hold of it. And so many disciples couldn't, and many disciples left him at this point. This is a hard teaching. We can't accept it, is what they were saying. It makes no sense to us. Can't eat his flesh and drink his blood. It's a revolting idea. I'm not going to accept that. In fact, the guy must be crazy. It's the kind of attitude which would have been presented here. And this grumbling a bit about Jesus was clearly going around the congregation, among the people there. Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you?" Well, yes, it did offend them. Offend them in the sense that they found it an insurmountable obstacle to get over. An offence comes from the same root meaning of the word as fence itself, something which is a barrier, something which is blocking the way, something which gets in the way of our understanding and submitting ourselves to you and following you as disciples. There was this fence or offence in the way. Does this offend you? And the answer was yes. That's a rhetorical question. Yes, it does offend you. But if that offends you, if this teaching, this spiritual teaching of mine offends you, then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? That would be even more difficult for you to understand, even more difficult for you to get over. Now, you might think that, well, if we see a miracle, then maybe we're more likely to believe. But I think that's been shown time and time again. That doesn't work that way. That's a very naive way of thinking. Simply show us the miracle and then we'll believe. Jesus knew for sure that doesn't work that way. People are only titillated by the extraordinary, by the magical. Anyone who has seen magicians on the street performing what seem like miracles, people are astounded and amazed, but it doesn't change their way of life. It doesn't make them want to adopt. They just are bemused and bedazzled and really, when it comes down to it, merely entertained. And that's the great danger of performing feats of unbelievable magic in front of people, that there's an entertainment factor which eclipses everything else. And so that's not the way to belief. The way to belief is to have a mind which is open to spiritual understandings, which resonates with the teachings of Jesus, and that when he says, you feed on my flesh and drink my blood, they can see beyond the mere physical, corporal nature of that and see into the meaning of it, to say that unless you partake with me and are so allied and closely take into yourself my teaching, my ways, so that I become a part of you and you become a part of me, unless you can actually see that spiritual connection between us, so that you see things through my eyes and you speak the words which I would speak, you think the way that I would think, you incorporate me into your life in such a way that I am the guiding principle to all that you do and think and are. If that's not how you are, then there is no life in you. That's what he means us to understand by it, and that's what most people did not. Does it offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? Again, this constant leitmotif, this theme which runs throughout the idea that Jesus has come down from heaven. And that really is the biggest miracle throughout John's Gospel. It's the biggest and most astounding statement of all of the statements in John's Gospel that started it with that in chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's what is being referred to constantly throughout. And if you can get over that stumbling block, then all else follows. Does it offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? If you can get over that understanding, that you accept that Jesus was beforehand with God, in the beginning of creation itself, then you'll have no problem with anything else here. The Spirit gives life, and the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. And if there's any explanation needed here as to the fact that I'm speaking on a different level, and you're understanding on a lower level, you're looking at things on a crass base level, but I'm speaking on a spiritual level. When I say you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, don't think of that physically. The words I speak to you are spirit, and if you understand them, then they will be life as well for you. My words are spirit and life. They are higher up in the thinking. So raise your gaze upwards. Put aside the crass, base understanding of a physical interpretation and give it spiritual clothes to understand what I'm really saying here. Jesus speaks in spiritual terms, in spiritual words, and for that reason has been misunderstood by many. But the people who don't misunderstand him, the ones who trust, even the words which they may not understand at the time, but because they've seen that he speaks so clearly and accurately of heaven that resonates within them, those are the people that God has drawn to Jesus, and he knows that that is the real secret of what brings people. God himself. The words I've spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe, because Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and would betray him. And this is the whole point of the matter. There are people who hear Jesus Christ speaking. There are those who believe what he says and hold on to those words as valuable and important as giving a clear insight and light on the God himself, God the Father, his character and nature. And there are those people who do not believe, who find the words a stumbling block, who find them an obstacle to understanding what he's meaning. They can't grasp the meaning because they're thinking at a different level. And so there are these two kinds of people, those who believe and follow, those who do not believe and fall away. And what explains the difference between the two? It's not the words which are said. The words divide, if you like, in an obvious way, because some follow and some are repelled. Some cleave tightly, like Simon Peter, and some fall to one side and reject. Who could follow this? And so, because of that lack of understanding, some disbelieve, and because of understanding, spiritual understanding, some believe. What makes the difference? Well, once again, Jesus makes it clear that it is God the Father who makes the difference. We don't choose very much as to what we can believe. Belief is not really a choice that we can make. I mentioned this before, any more than you can choose what tastes you like or what your favourite colour is. You don't choose these things for yourself. They're chosen for you. Your interests, your personality, who you are, they're chosen and given to you, almost as a gift. And so Jesus explains that here. This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him. In other words, the root of what attracts people to Jesus is the work of God the Father. Not necessarily down to you, says Jesus. You can only come to me if you have been spiritually enlightened, if you are spiritually awake, if you're not one of the dead who walk around and just do earthly and unimportant things and live a life which is of no spiritual life in it at all. So no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him. And there's something of the sovereignty of God in human life here, which Jesus promotes as being the ultimate cause of all things. And that means that he's not downcast when people turn away from him. He understands that's the inevitable consequence of the sovereignty of God at work in the world and in human life. Something which Jesus builds into his teaching, and which he uses to explain why it is that some believe and some do not. It's down to the sovereignty of God. No one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him. And from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him, because they couldn't go along with his teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. It's understandable. It's understandable how people could misunderstand that, because Jesus is speaking on a different plane. There's a challenge here also given to the closest 12. You do not want to leave too, do you? Written as a kind of a question here. Not a rhetorical question this time, but rather a genuine question. Do you want to leave me? Having heard this hard and difficult teaching that you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, do you want to leave me? Is that something which offends you as well? Is it something you can't get over? Is it a barrier? And Simon Peter answered him, speaking for all of them, I would say here, Lord, to whom shall we go? In other words, there is nobody else. There's no one else who speaks like you, no one else who thinks like you, no one else who acts like you. And there is something about you and your life which we cannot divorce ourselves from. You are the centre of our life, centre of Simon Peter's life here. You have the words of eternal life. And everything that you say, it enlivens us to a greater understanding of God. That's the implication here. And not only an understanding of God, but a deeper relationship with God, which forges that link with God, which brings with it in its train and wake a life eternal. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. And that is a term for the Messiah, the prophet, the single one. The idea is that you are the Holy One of God, not a Holy One of God, not a holy man, not someone who is someone with words of wisdom, one of many, But there's a very uniqueness in the very phrase here. You are the Holy One of God. And the word "the" is the key phrase or the key word here. It means that you are the one who has been prophesied about. You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. There is no one except you that we can follow. And Jesus replied, "Have I not chosen you, the 12? In other words, I've known that you would not desert me because I have specifically chosen you." And that choice was based upon the idea that I could see your character, your devotion, that even you would not find these words, "eat my flesh and drink my blood," a stumbling block. They'll make more sense to you later on, is the implication here. But even if they don't make sense to you here and now, they haven't caused you to forsake me or walk away. You can see there is some essential spiritual truth within these words, which you may still have difficulty grasping, but it's there and you're chasing after it, even if you don't fully understand it. And yet he said, although I've chosen all of you, all 12, one of you is a devil. Quite a condemnation. By a devil, someone who works malevolence, someone who is not dedicated to me, one who seeks to undermine my position, one who seeks to do me down, someone who works against me, someone who would lift his hand against me if he could, maybe thwarted by jealousy or other things. But of course it says here he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. And it comes to an interesting question at the end here, is why should Jesus choose someone, even from the outset, that he knew would be a devil, someone who would be unworthy of that choice, someone who would join. And it's quite an interesting thing to understand that it must be from the very start that Jesus had planned that one person would be someone who would betray him. Partly because the scriptures require that kind of thing in order to fulfill all righteousness. But it shows that the plans of God, the plans of Jesus, are so well formulated, even years beforehand. Everything was worked out according to a plan. And the plan was the plan that God had set forward, and the plan that Jesus was carrying out. Earlier on he said, I have come to finish the work which God has given me to do. And we see that even working itself out in the choice of Judas Iscariot.